Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going global, focusing the conversation around the findings of a new report published recently by Economist Impact called Infrastructure for Good, Building for a Better World. The report's been produced in association with Duke University in the US, and it's supported by global consultancy Deloitte. I'll put a link to the report in the show notes. But essentially, the report points out that while infrastructure is a transformational investment for supporting growth and social development, and really touches nearly all of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, around the world this investment delivers widely divergent outcomes. In short, without proper planning and a clear understanding of the factors behind this divergence, infrastructure can actually increase rather than reduce global inequality. So to guide us through this report, its conclusions and its recommendations, and of course to explain how it's been possible to properly understand the way infrastructure investment value can be benchmarked, I'm joined today from New York by Pratima Singh, Principal in Policy and Insights at the Economist Impact, one of the report authors and an expert in the economic and social drivers from infrastructure investment. Pratima, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thanks very much, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to talking about this with you.
Great. Well, Pratima, building on my very brief introduction, before we get into the nitty-gritty of your findings, what's the overriding purpose of this report? Essentially, why is it needed?
Yeah, that's a really great question, I think, to set context, Anthony. So, as you mentioned, infrastructure can really have an outsized and transformational impact on society, on communities, on the future generations and the environment. And so really looking at what that transformational impact is from connecting communities, powering our lives to creating a sustainable world. And so that's sort of the core of what we wanted to do when we sort of thought about infrastructure for good. But really we wanted to examine a couple of very critical things. Who benefits from infrastructure, whether it's communities, future generations, the environment, as I mentioned, how and what does that look like? So whether it's social impact, equality, inclusivity, economic opportunity, and then the key question here that we're going to sort of talk about in more detail is how. How can we build better infrastructure?
Well, let's talk about outcomes. The challenge is to set a benchmark for improving economic, social, and environmental outcomes. How do you define good, for each of these? Let's start with what's a good economic outcome?
Yeah, that's a really great question because we know what bad outcomes are, but what does good look like? So I think we can sort of turn to this barometer that's at the core of the research and the initiative here, where we benchmark 30 countries. And so we define that by creating a framework through interviews and discussions on what good looks like and how we can get there. And so one of the pillars of the framework is economic outcomes. And so when we think about what good economic outcomes are, it could be things like strong connectivity and participation, increased economic opportunity and effective job creation, vibrant local industry and economy, and of course, enhanced innovation and productivity.
Okay. What about social? What's a good social outcome then? Because, in many ways they're kind of wrapped up in the same thing, but how do you define a good social outcome?
Yeah, so for social outcomes, what we were doing was looking again at, what are the ways in which community participation is encouraged and enhanced. So we look at things like strong community engagement and support, conducting social assessments and progress mapping, whether it's protections for workers and communities. So of course, like you said, there could be interlinkages, but specifically when it comes to community and worker protection, that's part of the social outcomes. And then, of course, one very critical aspect of this is access to public services and utilities, which is also part of social. Yeah.
And of course, the final leg is good environmental outcomes. And maybe that's even more tricky because you're talking about sustainable outcomes. You're talking about net zero outcomes. You're talking about building resilience. All kinds of it. How do you describe a good environmental outcome?
Yeah, it's a lot. We're trying to pack a lot into this, but I think we would again sort of break it down into four sub pillars or indicator groups, if you will. Effective environmental management and policies, looking at resilience and adaptation, environmental impacts, and that includes things like protections for ecosystems, biodiversity, and other things, and then of course climate mitigation and decarbonization efforts.
And is there a hierarchy? Can you put a hierarchy to it? Which is which do you consider the most important? Is that relevant? Is it possible?
Yeah, so actually that's the beauty of the framework. Luckily, we can decide whether one is more important than the other. And so we can actually adjust the weights in the framework. But based off of our expert interviews and the discussions we've had, what we've done is categorized all of these different outcomes, social, economic, and environmental, as equal. So they're equally weighted at 21%.
Okay, I mean, presumably there's huge regional variations in performance and expectation, presumably also in weighting in terms of what's the most important around the world. I mean, how do you get that benchmarking correct?
Yeah. So the way we do this is we make sure that we want to reflect what's going on the ground, the challenges, the gaps that different countries face. So we create this framework by speaking with experts. So we obviously do literature reviews, data audits, all of that. So this is a year-long process, really. And then we conduct an advisory board, do expert interviews, speak to people on the ground, speak to policymakers, financiers, the entire stakeholder group, really, to make sure that we're sort of incorporating the absolute right methods, mechanisms, calculation techniques, and therefore reflecting what is needed. Now, of course, we've started with only 30 countries, so we do hope to expand. We can talk about that later, but that's sort of how we've examined what good looks like across the 30 countries.
And you also highlight what you call general foundations of infrastructure for good governance and planning and sustainable financing and investment. I mean, just explain, why you've chosen those as general foundations.
Yeah. So those are the first two pillars, like we said, foundations, and we really consider them prerequisites, really, to achieve any of these outcomes, whether it's positive social outcomes, economic or environmental. And so when we were speaking with experts, the themes of planning, governance, and financing were repeated. It really emphasized, of course, that are crucial through the early stages of the projects, but of course also throughout the life cycle. And so because infrastructure is quite complex and very risky as well, so we want to make sure that we're creating that enabling environment so that all projects have this. And so that comes through by building strong foundations in planning, and then, of course, ensuring effective financing, because if infrastructure is not financially sustainable, it's not going to be net positive, and so over the long term. And so we want to make sure that that's reflected as well.
Great. Now, it is an incredibly complex area. Let's talk through some of the detail of your report findings. And you say, for example, that better execution and financing are needed to achieve more consistent social, economic and environmental outcomes. Why do you say that?
Yeah. So if we look at it from the two pillars, really, so the foundational pillars of governance and financing, the first pillar, governance and planning, actually is the strongest performing pillar. The average score is 61.7 across the 30 countries. And so what we're seeing is that countries have put in place these mechanisms, these policies that are enabling them to create and cultivate these ecosystems for good infrastructure development. But when we look at the outcomes, the social, economic, and environment, we see inconsistencies in performance. And so what we're finding is that translation from effective policy to execution to achieve these outcomes is missing. And so we need to make sure that ability to strengthen that process, the implementation process, needs to be set up better. And so that's really kind of why we've suggested that better execution and financing is needed.
Okay, so, and is that something which is a government-led thing, or is that a private sector-led thing, or is it a combination of the two?
It's really a combination of two, I think. In this situation, what we're seeing is that there's a different role for public sector players, for private sector players, for multilaterals. Everyone else has a role to play. And so this is very much something that requires all stakeholders.
Okay. You also found that only Canada and the UK achieved strong results across all of your outcome pillars. I mean, why is that? Is that because we're more used to delivering infrastructure? Is that because we're doing more of it? Why is it, do you think?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the countries prioritizing and making an intentional effort to thinking about this in a more systemic and holistic way, right? So what we've seen that Canada and UK are prioritizing projects that fulfill multiple of these objectives or these goals. And so whether it's, prioritizing social along with the energy transition, whether it's, looking at policies and requirements that promote community engagement, social inclusion, economic outcomes, all of those things are there's an intentional focus here, which is really critical.
Okay. Another finding, and it's something which I think nations around the world are wrestling with, is that there's a mixed performance, you say, on environmental sustainability and resilience. Everyone's driving towards the net zero challenge. Everyone's driving to make sure that their infrastructure and their cities and their infrastructure assets are more resilient. I mean, where is it better or worse, and do you know why?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, like you said, this is top of mind for everyone right now. And what we found is that the focus right now and the best performance really within this particular outcome is on the planning and assessment side. So what we're seeing is that countries are creating the right strategies, conducting the assessments about what's needed from an environmental impact perspective, whether it's, this is good because this has to be done at the early stage of the process and of the planning, and it requires time, right? And so we're seeing that effort is being made. Where we're seeing a little bit of that gap or the struggle or the mixed performance really is on following through on some of these by enacting the right sort of environmental policies and enhancing those impacts. So, things like project level tactics on, improving monitoring and resilience, high level systemic policies that protect ecosystems, mitigate climate change. We're seeing some gaps on how that translates into actual project level or even local level outcomes. But on the planning side, we're seeing that's sort of being done. So hopefully it's just a matter of time, but that needs to be prioritized.
Well, I suppose it's also important to point out the report concludes that developed markets generally show strong rates of infrastructure investment, access to infrastructure, environmental sustainability and resilience. I mean, why is that a surprise, you could say?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, is it, surely?
It's not a surprise, given that we do know that developed markets do have more resources to sort of, I guess, support this. And so what we're trying to sort of highlight is also how is it, what can developing or emerging markets do that would allow them to achieve these same objectives and catch up, really. But how does all of this translate through stronger outcomes and environmental outcomes? And so it's really about creating that sort of virtuous cycle, we would say, which is that effective implementation, strong policy that then translates into effective implementation that enables better policy making and more resources to sort of flow into this sector and into these types of outcomes again. So really a combination of both public and private sector efforts here.
Finally, on this, a few details. I mean, you also highlight something which is talked an awful lot about in the UK, that systemic coordination and conducting national needs assessments are two areas that you say could unlock more purpose-driven development. What do you mean by purpose-driven development?
Yeah, that's a really great question because it really kind of feeds back into the core of this initiative and this project, which is really about designing infrastructure that is effective, efficient, but not just that. It has to be driven by a certain purpose. And what we've done is kind of highlight those three goals as the purpose, but really about just beyond just building a bridge, right? A bridge is not a bridge. A bridge is also enabling in the community the social outcomes that are far-reaching and beyond that. So really identifying what the benefits we want to achieve are, so that then becomes the purpose, and making sure that the individuals, communities, businesses, future generations are able to achieve that.
I think it's a great phrase because it's something which so often is missed. Why are we building? Why are we investing in this infrastructure? It's not just for the question of building a hospital. What do we need to be in that hospital? Where does it need to be? What's the purpose?
And how does it build that resilience? I think that's the key, right? It's the resilience, the ability to deliver on that rather than just build a road.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's talk a bit about you. You're originally from India, but you've studied and worked in infrastructure research in Singapore, at UCL in London, and now you're in New York. I mean, what gets you fired up about infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that, infrastructure is really all around us, right? Everyone is sort of privy to it. Everyone benefits from it, hopefully. And so I think it was really interesting for me to see how infrastructure varies across regions, whether it's Asia, whether it's Europe, and now the US. And so that's been really interesting interesting and sort of something that drives me around understanding more and questioning infrastructure.
There must be a huge difference in looking when you're looking at the infrastructure in India, infrastructure in New York, infrastructure in London. It's hugely different. I mean, living in Singapore, it must provide a different perspective. I mean, it's often said that that region really leads the world in terms of infrastructure thinking. I mean, do you agree? You see that, you witnessed it.
I did. Singapore, obviously, we haven't benchmarked Singapore in this research quite yet, but just out of personal experience, Singapore's infrastructure is really world class. It is very, very efficient, effective, affordable, and I think that we kind of also see that with other high-income Asian countries, whether it's Japan, Australia, or Korea, that we've benchmarked. The pillars of governance and planning have been really, really positive in these markets. And so I think it really starts there. And I would assume a similar thing for Singapore as well.
Yeah. A stark contrast, I imagine, from where you are in New York right now.
Yes and no. I think there are things in New York that work as well. Of course, it's a bigger city. It requires a lot more engagement at different levels. And so there are variations in policy planning and other things.
Well, it leads me to think, having spent a career studying the impact of infrastructure in communities, I mean, where would you choose to live? You've been hopping around the world. Where would you choose to live from an infrastructure perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think I would say...
So you've got all the insight. You've got all the insight there.
Yeah, I've got all the information. So it's kind of it's not a free, fair decision-making process. But I think Canada does really well. So that's definitely a country that's prioritizing infrastructure for good. But also when we look generally, Europe has a lot of markets that are, creating good infrastructure. So I would say those are the two top of mind. But I know there are interesting regions and projects and local level of efforts across the globe.
Okay. I thought you were going to say the UK for a moment.
Well, I've done the UK, so now I'm looking at Canada.
Fair enough. Okay, let's look at the wider picture just to follow up. I mean, the report says that developed countries see significant competitive advantages from their robust infrastructure networks, while emerging markets lag in terms of connectivity and competitiveness. I mean, how might that competitive advantage manifests itself in a country like UK, for instance?
Yeah. So the UK is an interesting example. So one of the places where we see the strongest performance in the UK is in the rankings and scores for digital connectivity and participation. And so that's one area where we can see that competitive advantage is really translated. I mean, we're seeing strong reliance on digital networks to function effectively, city level, for private sector, for businesses. And so that's really enabling businesses to be more productive, opening doors for people, for more effective participation in, community and discussions on policy. And so, like the UK, other countries are also benefiting from this, whether it's digital connectivity, whether it's strong transport networks, water and sanitation systems, and of course, the core of all of this is effective social infrastructure like health and education systems.
So what does a country like the UK have to do to increase its ability to create infrastructure for good?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because one of the things that we haven't discussed in more detail, but this is important in the UK's case, is that second pillar around financing, and financing for social good in particular. That's really one of the more weak performances, I think, across the different countries that we're seeing, and the UK is really no exception to that. But there is a growing popularity. We're seeing some efforts being made around, more green financing or sustainability-linked financing or loans. And so that's another area where the UK can also sort of improve its performance, use those tools to not just do environmental outcome or linked to environmental outcomes, but also social outcomes.
Yeah. Well, the whole ESG drive in infrastructure financing is never been so high up the agenda. You really cannot get infrastructure invested in without really strong ESG performance. I mean, that surely is growing a huge amount over the last wee while.
It's absolutely grown a lot, and there is a lot of focus on it. I think it's also now about how does that translate into actual project level financing, and how do we create that for all projects, not just one or two projects, right? And so that's really where the support of public-private agencies, the public sector more generally, to be able to get some of these projects and initiatives off the ground that make social outcomes just as important as environmental and economic.
Okay. You also highlight clean energy as a significant jobs generator. It's something which the UK government is talking about, trying to generate the new green economy. Certainly the US has got its IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which is really targeting green jobs, etc. I mean, which parts of the world are you seeing this happening most significantly?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because this is something that, like you said, we're already seeing in action. And so it's interesting to figure out what are some of those learnings. So the current leaders on being able to create that jobs boom as a result of the transition to clean energy are Brazil and Sweden. So they're creating a significant number of jobs in that transition to renewables. But there are also other performers like Poland, China, and then a couple of countries in, Asia, like Indonesia and Thailand, and even Saudi Arabia, that are using this to take advantage of that shift, but also create economic benefits.
Let's talk about silo thinking. And you say efforts towards infrastructure for good can be amplified by thinking of infrastructure as an ecosystem rather than in silos, trying to break down those barriers, those silos between different departments. I mean, it's a perennial problem. I mean, what's the solution?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's also interesting that we talked about the perennial problem with outcomes. So when we prioritize certain outcomes like only economic or only environmental, we don't see those benefits, right? The benefit from the transition to, the renewable energy sector or that energy transition. Similarly, when we kind of think through effective planning and break down those silos around, energy or, roads and transport, that can help. So when we think about projects and bundle them up to be able to create more than just one type of outcome, that really helps. So whether it's having effective and effective agencies and coordinating agencies on thinking about what are the different benefits, national strategies, needs assessments, participatory planning, all of these things can help with breaking down silos.
Hard though, it's really hard. I mean, because you've got to get government departments to talk to each other, you've got to get different sectors to talk, and that's really, really hard. It's the same problem all around the world though.
Yeah, it is. But that's kind of why you need to have agencies that are accountable, that are also then able to talk to other agencies rather than, everyone doing their own thing. So someone has to be accountable for all. And one example I'll share actually is the Infrastructure Victoria strategy. So it's a 30-year strategy. It's a separate agency, and they are really conducting assessments long-term, not just today, but long-term. What do we need? And then who needs to be involved?
Okay, which is what you describe as the double dividend, isn't it? Where this transition to sustainable infrastructure solves other challenges. You are seeing that. You're seeing that happening around the world, though.
Yeah, double dividend is interesting. Some projects have triple dividends, right? We've done a case study on a project in Canada called the Tudeka geothermal plant. And that project is really looking at improving social, economic, and environmental outcomes through the transition. So really thinking about this more from a systems approach rather than one particular project at a time can help.
So just finally, what happens next for this report? I mean, is it an annual piece of research you're doing?
Yeah, this is the first time. This is the inaugural barometer. And what we hope to do is over time expand it to more countries and then, kind of create this very much as a recurring initiative that allows us to then benchmark progress over time. And so our supporters, Deloitte and Duke University's Nicholas School of Energy, Environment and Sustainability have been really helpful in supporting this initiative. And we hope to do more going forward.
How do you hope the global infrastructure investment and delivery sector will benefit from it?
Yeah, I think that honestly, it will help drive awareness and urgency. So there's incredible urgency. We're spending so much on infrastructure today. We have our 2030 goals on SDGs. Can we do more to make sure that infrastructure helps us achieve this? Can we create a roadmap? And how do we help ensure that countries learn from peers on what needs to be done?
Well, very finally then, if there's one key UK-focused takeaway from the report, the one thing that everyone listening should keep top of mind, what is it?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I know this is like a 30-second bit, but so the UK does well. I will say they rank number 2. They're just behind Canada with a score of 69.6. But that doesn't mean there's still a lot of room for improvement. And so focusing on financing, focusing on ensuring those silos break down, and looking at things from a triple dividend perspective almost should be a priority.
Great. A great point to end on, Pratima. Some really interesting work, and lots to really get your head around there. So thanks very much for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast and for sharing it and explaining it to us.
Thanks very much, Anthony. It's been great chatting with you about this.
Great. As I say, I'll put a link to the report in the show notes so that you can get a download of that. But thanks very much, Pratima, for joining us. That's all we've got time for today, but we're going to have more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. And if you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you will find background links to the issues discussed today and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share with your colleagues. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks again to Pratima, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.